while since I've done one of these. I'm not really too sure why. I think, in all honesty, I put doing them off because they take longer to edit, so I just cop out and do something else. But I have scheduled in plenty of history videos over the next month or two. And as you can tell by the title, today we are covering the race to the South Pole. Definitely an interesting topic, and I believe it was requested by one of you, so you should know who you are. Thank you for the suggestion. I do read them all, of course. I believe the one after this I've got penciled in to do is the Napoleonic War, maybe. I do want to go back to doing more of the sort of traditional war histories, because it's been a while since we've done one of them. But today we're going to be taking a look at the race to the South Pole, and the way this article and way the video is going to be sort of structured is we're going to look at the various stages of the race and compare the two individuals and their teams side by side in terms of how they prepared, how they dealt with challenges, and then obviously who won. So hopefully you find this relaxing as well as informative and entertaining. And without further ado, let's get into it. The Attainment of the South Pole by Roald Amundsen, ahead of Robert Scott, has frequently described Amundsen as the winner in a race. Over 100 years later, there is still debate about the events, how well the two men were prepared, how they conducted themselves, what role luck had to play, and not least of their legacies. They both led 5-man teams to the pole, though while Amundsen's team returned alive and well, Scott's party all died on the return journey. What has become known as the race to the South Pole came about incidentally rather than by design. At no time did Amundsen and Scott acknowledge or plan for a race. They both planned expeditions that had as an ambition to be the first man to reach one of the last great geographic goals of the age, the South Pole. There was controversy almost from the outset. Scott set off thinking his would be the only party in Antarctica with an ambition of reaching the South Pole at that time. Amundsen was to try for the North Pole, but changed his plans when he heard that Americans Cook and Peary had claimed to have reached there, fearing he would be financially ruined, and so set the scene unilaterally for a race. Amundsen returned home in triumph and was well received on lecture tours describing his achievement. This was soured when months later the news arrived that Scott and his party had also reached the South Pole, but had all perished on the way back. Somewhat ironically, Scott and his party became the heroes of the peace, Scott himself being held as a major national hero in Britain, while Amundsen, not actually seen as the villain, was passed over for further acclaim. The hailing of Scott as the most noble kind of national hero continued almost without question for more than half a century, until his failings began to be pointed out and his story began to attract criticism towards the end of the 20th century. Amundsen found life difficult on his return. He was wounded by accusations of unsporting conduct in the manner that he arrived in Antarctica to race Scott to the pole without giving any prior notice of intention. These accusations were all the more painful because he and his team survived, while Scott and his party all perished. He died in 1928 in what was assumed to be an airplane crash in the Arctic, after wreckage but no bodies were found. Many lessons were learned about exploration in the Antarctic from both Amundsen and Scott, from successes and failures that would be invaluable for future expeditions. Their stories are fascinating for many reasons, and reveal them as complex characters affected by a whole host of factors. The way they were received by the world and their countries is almost as complex. I feel the greatest compliment to both of them is that there is now a large scientific station at the South Pole, manned year-round, called the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. comparison of Amundsen and Scott in relation to preparations to reach the South Pole and afterwards. Who won is clear, though only if you consider there was a competition. So we begin with before the pole, and we start with Amundsen. So prior experience: 2 years on the Belgica expedition to Antarctica, 1897 to 1899, 3.5 years sailing the Northwest Passage to the Gjoa, 1903 to 06, and much experience in the Arctic using dog sleds and skis. At the age of 21, he abandoned his studies to be a doctor when his mother died and instead pursued a life of polar exploration. Amundsen's background to the South Pole attempt: he was given the ship Fram by Fridtjof Nansen to attempt to drift across the North Pole. He paid for supplies and wages by asking others for financial backing. In September 1909, American Robert Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole. Amundsen's plans were ruined, and he may have been personally financially ruined as a result if he couldn't deliver a success. He changed his plans and headed to the South Pole instead, without telling his backers or making it public until he was well underway in case the project was ended before it had begun. The captain of the Fram was told in advance, and 2 other men were told on the day of departure. The rest of the crew were not told until the Fram had sailed south to Madeira, supposedly for oceanographical research. It's a great ASMR word, oceanographical. Amundsen claimed that he thought Scott's expedition was scientific, only with the pole being a side issue, despite Scott making a public announcement nearly a year earlier about an attempt on the pole. The aims of Amundsen's expedition: to be the first party to reach the South Pole. Scientific complement: 0. The route: they started at the Bay of Whales, 60 miles closer to the pole than Scott, with no scientific programme, no compromise needed to be made. More of the journey distance was made over the Ross Ice Shelf, meaning that less of the journey was at the altitude of the polar plateau. The men would function more efficiently for longer and be subjected to colder, high-altitude temperatures for a shorter amount of time. Access to the polar plateau was made by going up a glacier discovered by Amundsen and called the Axel-Heiber Glacier after one of his patrons. If I can find some maps, I'll put them on the screen so you can get a sense of his route. Amundsen and his team had chosen not to go the known Beardmore Glacier route, as that was Scott's and out of bounds. The route up to the plateau involved much gain and loss of height. It has been said that it is easier to make this journey with a dog team, which would have much greater difficulty on the Beardmore, though subsequent assessment has found this route is very difficult in itself. Only a very skilled and experienced team of handlers could attempt it. So that was Amundsen's side before the pole. Let's switch over to Scott's perspective. So Scott's prior experience: he had 3 years as leader of the Discovery expedition to Antarctica in 1901 to 1904. Of 50 men on the expedition, hardly any had any polar experience. There was very little prior or ongoing training to use equipment or techniques, such as dog sledding or skiing. An officer in the British Navy seeking advancement, partly due to reduced family circumstances. In The Voyage of the Discovery, he wrote, "I may as well confess that I had no predilection for polar exploration." So, not quite as experienced as Amundsen. So, background to his South Pole attempt. Scott returned to Britain a hero after the Discovery expedition. He resumed his naval career, now promoted to captain. On the Discovery, he had fallen out with the Ernest Shackleton, who was by 1906 planning his own Antarctic expedition. expedition, Scott felt Shackleton had no claim to go to the McMurdo area as he had prior right to this sector. Scott was very much the establishment man and was chosen to head the official British Antarctic expedition. Scott stated that the main objective was to reach the South Pole and to secure for the British Empire the honour of this achievement. Scott arranged for ponies, dogs and motor sleds to be purchased through still favoured man-hauling, as did his backers in the Navy. Regardless of preference, it was thought that motor sleds, dogs and ponies would not be able to ascend the highly crevassed Beardmore Glacier, the route pioneered by Shackleton in 1909. While other means could be used to lay depots, they would have to man-haul to the pole. Aims of the expedition: to be the first party to reach the South Pole, stated by Scott as being the main aim. A large and wide-ranging programme of scientific measurements, experimentation and discovery. Scientific complement 12. So Scott's route. Scott made his base at Cape Evans on Ross Island, a more suitable base for scientific explorations, though further from the pole and subjected to sea ice melting or forming dictated when the start-end of the journey could be attempted. The grammar of this article is horrific. The route he was to take was that pioneered by Shackleton during his 0709 expedition, reaching the polar plateau along the active Beardmore Glacier, which was very broken up and crevassed, slowing progress. Unlike Amundsen's access to the plateau via the short and steep Axelweiber Glacier, this was a long, slow climb that should have been easier for dogs, ponies and motor sleds, though it was actually worse due to its broken up nature with crevasses and icefalls. Scott's journey was longer and he spent more time at the altitude of the polar plateau, with its thinner air and colder temperatures. Okay, so we're now going to compare the two explorers' preparations for the trip, beginning with Amundsen again. So means of transport, Amundsen had much experience with sled dogs during his trip to the Kiowa across the Northwest Passage. He had lived with and learned much from the Inuit about how to use them and what were their strengths and weaknesses. Norwegians at the time tended to use reindeer as pack animals. His plan with the dogs was to use many of them in the early part of the trip with heavy loads and to get up onto the polar plateau, to then kill them and then use them to feed the men and other dogs in the later part of the journey. Oh, that's delicious, isn't it? Once up in the polar plateau, 24 dogs were killed out of 52 taken, 11 returned alive. All of the Norwegians could ski well. Olaf Bjarland was recruited to the expedition on his strengths as a champion skier. The speed of the dogs and skiers meant that longer periods of rest were possible. Interesting. And then food and fuel. Amundsen's team actually gained weight during the journey to the pole, partly due to the extra food available from the dogs that were killed along the route. Amundsen was particularly fastidious in marking the route during the depot laying preparations, meaning that his team could travel even in poor visibility conditions. They had more frequent food depots. Amundsen depoted 3 times the amount of food that Scott did. Depotted. I can't. Maybe I think I might be reading. Depotted. Is depotted a word? I'm saying depoted, but that doesn't make sense. I'm just going to say depotted from now on because I'm scared. The paraffin fuel used for the stoves creeps in cold temperatures. That is, it leaks out of the screw top to the can and evaporates. Amundsen made sure all fuel cans were also soldered closed until they were to be opened, leading to no fuel losses. Smart guy. The sledging rations Amundsen took included oatmeal and pemmican with peas in it. This would have given them vitamins that would help prevent scurvy. And then clothing. The Norwegians took Inuit-style clothing made entirely out of furs, another thing Amundsen learned from his Kujoa expedition. They were worn loose to allow for the loss of sweat during exertion, meaning that it didn't then freeze inside the clothing when at rest. So Amundsen sounds like a pretty smart Donny, to be honest. I'm going to assume that Scott wasn't as smart, judging by the fact a load of his crew died, or everyone died. So moving on to Scott's side of preparations. Scott has been much criticised for his transport choices. While he did take motorsleds, ponies, dogs and an expert skier, Trygve Gran, to teach his men to ski, each of these was poorly used. The largest of the 3 motorsleds was lost while being taken ashore. The remaining 2 were unreliable, and Skelton, the expert in their use, was left behind for reasons of naval rank protocols in the South Pole journey. The remaining 2 sleds failed and could not be fixed. The ponies had snowshoes to stop them sinking in soft snow, but they were not used, so severely limiting their usefulness. Not enough of the men were expert enough with the dogs to be effective, and there were insufficient dogs in the first place. Finally, while Scott encouraged his men to learn to ski, they were reluctant and he did not insist on them learning. He was left with the most exhausting and slowest method of man-hauling, though he considered this to be more noble. Food and fuel. Theoretical measurements and practical modern experimentation has shown that Scott's team had insufficient food for their needs. They were all in quite a poor state by the time they reached the pole. Calculations had been made by Scott, but he was not aware of the greater need for food while man-hauling at the altitude of the polar plateau, and so underestimated how much was needed. Scott ignored the phenomenon of fuel creep, loss from the paraffin cans, even though it was well known. Consequently, his team was short of fuel, possibly also leading to dehydration, as less snow could be melted for water to replace the deceptively large amount lost when exercising at low temperatures. They were almost certainly also suffering from the debilitating effects of scurvy too, due to the lack of vitamins in their sledging rations. The ponies were killed for food when they had outlived their usefulness, like Amundsen's dogs. So basically, I'm getting the sense everything Amundsen did well, Scott did horrifically. And then clothing. Scott's men had woolen underwear with windproof outer layers. The layer system was good and is used today. There was a problem with allowing for sufficient ventilation during exertion, meaning that sweat froze in the clothes, making them hard and stiff, especially after a camp. Next section, reaching the pole. So, Amundsen's first attempt, 8th of September 1911. Amundsen was concerned by the idea that Scott's motor sledges would allow him to reach the pole first, and wanted to set off as soon as possible after the sun rose again in late August. Against the advice of Johansen that it was too cold, he set off on the 8th of September 1911 with 8 of the 9 men on his expedition. Daytime travel was good, and they made very good progress in the first few days, despite very cold temperatures. It was so cold at night, however, that they could hardly sleep, and some of the dogs suffered from frostbitten paws. By the 12th, with temperatures of minus 56 degrees Celsius, they stopped and built igloos for shelter before returning to the ship to try again later. Some of the dogs froze to death on the way back. Others, too weak to run, were placed on the sledges. Amundsen ordered his men to push for home as soon as possible, rather than travelling as a group. Amundsen and 2 others arrived back first after 9 hours. Another sledge 2 hours later, and the final 2, including Johansen, over 17 hours after setting off. Johansen answered Amundsen's question about why they had been so late angrily, feeling they had been abandoned without food or fuel and suffering from frostbite. Amundsen later reported that he and the 19th of October 1911. Amundsen set out again with 5 men, 4 sledges and 52 dogs. Once again they made good progress, though Amundsen deliberately avoided the Beardmore Glacier route that Scott would take to get from the near sea level ice shelf and onto the Antarctic plateau. He found a steep and difficult but direct route up a small glacier he named after Axel Heiberg, one of his financial backers. 7 of his dogs had died on the ice barrier to reach the glacier. All but the remaining 18 were killed at the top of the glacier. The carcasses were eaten eagerly by the dogs and men alike. Some were deported to be picked up on the return journey. They reached the pole on the 14th of December 1911, 56 days after setting off. They stayed in the vicinity of the pole before setting off on their return journey on the 18th. During this time they took navigational readings at different times of the day and travelled in the vicinity to make sure they really had reached the South Pole. Amundsen left a tent and a letter addressed to the King of Norway with a request to Scott to deliver it. So he was rubbing it in. He was like, "Oh, Scott, if you get a second, deliver this for me." I love that level of pettiness. They arrived back at the Fram on the 25th of January 1912, just 38 days after leaving the South Pole. The whole trip had taken 99 days, 10 less than anticipated, and they had covered 3,440 kilometres. 5 men and 52 dogs had set off. 5 men and 11 dogs had returned. Justice for the dogs, honestly. Scott left his camp with men travelling with motor sledges, dogs, ponies, and on foot on the 1st of November 1911. Only a small party of 4 would go all the way to the pole. The others were there to help transport food and supplies to be used on the outward journey and left as supply dumps to be used by the pole group on the way back again. The ponies were killed during this march, some of the meat eaten and some of it deported, as Amundsen did with his dogs. Eventually there were 2 teams, each of 4 men, man-hauling sledges and provisions. Though he had planned for 4, Scott decided to take a 5-man party to the pole, including himself. The remaining 3 turned back to the ship. Scott's party arrived at the pole on the 17th of January 1912, 77 days after setting off. They found that Amundsen had beaten them by 5 weeks. Their condition was deteriorating by this time due to an insufficient diet in quantity and nutrients. Scurvy was probably beginning to take effect. They rested for a day and set off to return on the 19th. Despite unusually cold weather, their diet and low morale, they made good progress to the edge of the polar plateau. During the 100-mile descent of the Beardmore Glacier from the plateau down to near sea level, one of the party, Edgar Evans, suffered a fall on the 4th of February that left him dull and incapable. He never really recovered and fell again on the 17th, dying near to the foot of the glacier. Scott had left orders for dog teams to meet the polar party at 82.30s about the 1st of March 1912. The remaining 4 men reached this point by the 27th of February. By the 10th of March they gave up on seeing the dogs arriving. They had about 400 miles left to go in difficult surface conditions and unusually cold temperatures. On this day, Captain Lawrence Oates, with badly frostbitten feet, walked out from the tent in a blizzard to his death. His last reported words were, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." It's actually really sad. He obviously just went crazy. They walked another 20 miles, all suffering badly now, and made their final camp on the 19th of March. Blizzards prevented further progress, and they stay in their tent with dwindling supplies. Scott's final diary entry was on the 29th of March. He is thought to have been the last to die on this or the next day. 70 days after leaving the pole, their last camp was just 11 miles short of the 1-ton depot where food and fuel could have saved them. That is just 11 miles away from being saved. That's still a long way, obviously. The 3 bodies in the tent were not found until 8 months later, on the 12th of November 1912. A large cairn of snow was erected over the tent and a makeshift cross erected. Before the Terra Nova left for home, a memorial cross was erected on Observation Hill, overlooking Hut Point. The cross is still there today. So we take a look to after the pole, so take a look at each of their sort of legacies and stuff. Amundsen. The next year, Amundsen was keen to get back to civilization as soon as possible to announce his achievement to the world, as you would. The Fram sailed north and on March the 8th, 1912, reached Hobart, Australia, from where he cabled his brother with the news and made a public announcement. He was lecturing under the title, How We Reached the Pole, in Sydney, Australia, less than a month later at the beginning of April 1912, and proceeded to a lecture tour of Britain under the same title. By the time the news of Scott broke, the following February, he was in the USA giving the same lectures under the heading Discoverer of the South Pole and winner in the international race for the southern extremity of the Earth. Bit over the top, but okay. On August 20th, 1912, all of the crew of the Fram who were with Amundsen were awarded the South Pole Medal by King Haakon of Norway, a modified version of the existing honour, the King's Medal of Merit. Amundsen was widely regarded as acting in an ungentlemanly way in the way that he had decided to race Scott to the pole at the last minute when his North Pole ambitions had been thwarted, especially as he had kept it a secret from almost all the interested and involved parties, any one of whom may have pulled out of his change plans had they have known. He was seen as unsportingly playing the game for his own ends. Yeah, he did leave that passive-aggressive letter. There was little worse that a gentleman could be accused of in Edwardian Britain, or indeed the wider world at the time. At a meeting in London to honour his polar success, the Royal Geographical Society president called for 3 cheers for the dogs, and amen to that. I agree. The next 15 years, the South Polar trip rendered Amundsen financially solvent again and enabled him to establish a shipping business which did well during the war years. He remained dedicated to polar exploration, involving himself in an unsuccessful attempt to drift over the North Pole in a ship in 1918. After this, he became interested in flying and trying to reach the North Pole by plane, though again without success. In 1926, along with American Lincoln Ellsworth and Italian Umberto Nobile, he successfully drifted over the pole in an airship from Spitsbergen in Norway to Alaska. The claims to have reached the North Pole by Cook and Peary have both been disputed. In the case of Cook, it is widely accepted that he did not do so. In the case of Peary, it is likely, though not proven, that he did not. If Peary did not reach the North Pole, this make Amundsen part of groups to have reached both the South and North Poles for the first time. Roald Amundsen died with a crew of 5 in a small flying boat that took off from Tromsø, Norway in June 1928 on a rescue mission for Nobile and 2 others whose airship had crashed on the way back from the North Pole. While wreckage of the plane was later found, no bodies were ever recovered. Amundsen took the criticism of the manner in which he became first to the South Pole badly. It is said that he was much troubled by the fact that Scott and his men died, though Amundsen's actions had no actual impact or influence on Scott's men. He was described as unhappy, and that he felt the rest of his life to be an anticlimax. He didn't receive the same adulation or financial security that his mentor Nansen had done, even though Amundsen's achievements eclipsed Nansen's. Still, Amundsen was overlooked for many years, largely being in the shadow of Scott. questioned from the late 60s onwards that Amundsen was able to emerge into the light somewhat, even in his native Norway. Not until the 100th anniversary of reaching the pole, the 14th of December 2011, was a South Pole monument to Amundsen and his party unveiled in Oslo, the Norwegian capital. It consists of life-size bronze statues of the 5 men standing on granite slabs, based on a photo taken of them while standing at the South Pole. And there we have it. That is the conclusion of the race to the South Pole. So, to summarise, Amundsen had more experience, prepared way better than Scott. Scott didn't prepare well at all, but Amundsen was kind of a bit of a dick, and really rubbed it in Scott's face and went behind the back of the people backing him, because he'd already been beaten to the North Pole, so he wanted to get to the South quicker. I kind of rate the pettiness, but I can understand why people had a problem with it at the time, and it's just very typical that we praise the dead man rather than the man who actually survived and did the thing. But eventually Amundsen got the praise he probably deserved, or definitely deserved. It was definitely a difficult job, something I would never do. You can pay me to do that, so fair play, well done, Rolled, or whatever your name was, congrats. But anyways, that is going to do it for this video. I really hope you did enjoy. I hope you found it relaxing and informative. Remember to leave your comments down below for suggestions of historical periods and events you'd like to see covered. I think I mentioned I'm going to do like a war history soon, but I'm definitely going to branch out into slightly longer history videos looking at different periods of time, so like the Bronze Age, Stone Age, Iron Age, blah blah blah, and like summarising the key events that, you know, influenced the progression of those ages, that kind of thing. If that's something you'd be interested in, then let me know down below. But that is going to do it for tonight's video. If you did enjoy it,